In August 1971, a psychologist at Stanford University built a prison. Not a real one, a simulation. He recruited 24 college students, normal kids, screened for mental health, no criminal records, no violent tendencies. He paid them $15 a day to participate in what he called a psychological study of prison life. Half would be guards, half would be prisoners. The experiment was designed to run for 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. Not because funding ran out, not because someone got physically injured. It ended because within less than a week, psychologically healthy young men had transformed into sadistic abusers and broken, traumatized victims. The guards weren't trained to be cruel. The prisoners weren't criminals. But the situation turned them into monsters and victims anyway. And if you look at what's happening right now in 2026, if you look at the collapse of trust in institutions, if you look at the way authority is fracturing across every level of society, police, government, corporations, media, you'll realize something disturbing. We aren't just studying that experiment anymore. We are inside it. And according to the pattern, we just entered the final phase. Let me tell you about Philip Zimbardo and his basement prison. Zimbardo was a psychology professor at Stanford, fascinated by one question nobody else was asking in 1971. What happens to good people when you put them in a bad system? Not what happens when bad people get power. We already know that story. Criminals abuse power, dictators abuse power. That's expected. But what happens when you take ordinary, decent human beings and drop them into a structure where some have total authority and others have none? Do the roles change the people, or do the people resist the roles? In the summer of 1971, Zimbardo decided to find out. He converted the basement of Stanford's psychology building, Jordan Hall, into a makeshift prison. He built cells out of laboratory rooms. He installed a closet-sized solitary confinement space he called the Hole. He removed clocks, windows, anything that would let participants track time or feel connected to the outside world. Then he placed an advertisement in local newspapers offering $15 per day, about $110 in today's money, to male college students willing to participate in a study of prison life. 75 people responded. Zimbardo and his team conducted interviews, personality assessments, medical and psychological screenings. They wanted to eliminate anyone with a history of crime, violence, drug abuse, or mental illness. They were looking for the most normal, stable, average young men they could find. They selected 24. Then came the coin flip, literally. Zimbardo randomly assigned participants to one of two groups, prisoners or guards. This wasn't based on personality. It wasn't based on physical characteristics. It was pure chance. On August 14th, 1971, the experiment began. And Zimbardo didn't start small. He wanted realism, he wanted immersion, so he contacted the Palo Alto Police Department and arranged for actual police officers to conduct real arrests. On a quiet Sunday morning, 9 young men who had volunteered for a psychology study were suddenly confronted by police cars, sirens, officers with handcuffs. They were charged with armed robbery and burglary, penal codes 211 and 459. They were read their Miranda rights. They were searched in public in front of neighbors and passersby. They were driven to the Palo Alto police station in squad cars, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in holding cells, blindfolded to disorient them. Then, Zimbardo's research assistants picked them up and transported them to the Stanford County Jail, the basement prison. When the blindfolds came off, the prisoners were stripped naked, searched, deloused with a spray, and forced to stand in front of a full-length mirror while guards shouted at them. They were given uniforms, not normal clothes, but cheap smocks that resembled dresses, designed to humiliate and emasculate. No underwear. A chain was padlocked around each prisoner's ankle, a constant reminder of their captivity. Each prisoner was assigned a number, no names. From that moment forward, they would only be referred to and would only refer to themselves by number. De-individuation, erasure of identity. That was the point. The guards, meanwhile, received a very different treatment. They were given uniforms, plain khaki shirts and pants, wooden batons, mirrored sunglasses that prevented eye contact and hid their expressions. They were told their job was to maintain order and prevent escape, but they were given no specific instructions on how to do that. No training, no rules of engagement. Zimbardo told them explicitly, you can create feelings of boredom, fear, a sense of arbitrariness, but no physical violence. Everything else was up to them. And then he stepped back to watch. Except Zimbardo didn't just watch. He became the prison superintendent. He assigned himself a role inside the experiment, not as an outside observer, but as an authority figure within the system. That decision, that blurring of the line between researcher and participant, would later be recognized as one of the most catastrophic errors of the entire study. For the first few hours, everything seemed almost playful. The guards weren't sure how seriously to take their roles. The prisoners were uncomfortable, but not yet afraid. It felt like a game, like college students playing dress-up. But that illusion didn't last. By the end of the first day, the guards had begun asserting control. They woke prisoners in the middle of the night for counts, forcing them to recite their numbers over and over. They made prisoners do push-ups for minor infractions. They withheld bathroom privileges, forcing inmates to use a bucket in their cells. And the prisoners, even though they knew this was a study, even though they could theoretically quit at any time, started to comply. They stopped resisting. They started to believe on some deep psychological level that they actually were prisoners. And before we go any further, I need to pause here for a second. If you're watching this and you're starting to see where this is going, if you're realizing that we're not just talking about a 50-year-old psychology experiment, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Because this story doesn't stay in 1971. It's happening right now in your city, in your country, in institutions you interact with every single day. I want to know where you are when you realize how deep this goes. Subscribe, comment with your city. Let's see how global this pattern really is. By day 2, the experiment had fundamentally changed. A rebellion broke out. Prisoner number 8612, one of the inmates, ripped off his number, barricaded himself and other prisoners inside their cell using their beds, and began shouting demands. They refused to come out. They refused to follow orders. For a brief moment, it looked like the prisoners might take control, but the guards didn't back down. They called in the entire guard shift, even those who were off duty. They used fire extinguishers to blast the prisoners with CO2 through the bars, forcing them to retreat. They stripped the ringleaders naked, threw them into solitary confinement, and confiscated their beds and mattresses. Then the guards did something psychologically brilliant and cruel. They created a privilege cell. They took the prisoners who hadn't participated in the rebellion and gave them special treatment. They got their beds back. They got to wash. They got better food. The rebellious prisoners watched from their cells as their fellow inmates were rewarded for compliance. This broke the prisoners' solidarity almost immediately. Suspicion spread. Who was a snitch? Who was collaborating? The guards had turned the inmates against each other without saying a word. And then, just as suddenly, the guards switched everything. They moved the good prisoners back into the bad cells and gave privileges to the former rebels. Now, nobody knew what the rules were. Arbitrary, unpredictable. The prisoners stopped trying to figure out the system because the system had no logic. It existed only to demonstrate that the guards had total control. By day 3, the psychological damage was visible. Prisoner number 8612, the one who had led the rebellion, began showing signs of severe distress. He was crying, screaming, experiencing uncontrollable rage. Zimbardo and his team thought he was faking it, trying to get released. They confronted him, told him to toughen up, told him he couldn't leave until a parole hearing. Finally, after hours of deterioration, they let him go. The experiment had been running for less than 72 hours, and they had already psychologically broken a healthy young man. But they didn't stop the study. They convinced themselves it was an isolated case. It wasn't. Over the next 3 days, 4 more prisoners would have emotional breakdowns severe enough to require early release. One developed a psychosomatic rash across his entire body. Another went on a hunger strike and was thrown into the hole, a tiny closet, where he stayed for hours in total darkness. Meanwhile, the guards were escalating. Some remained relatively passive, doing the minimum required to maintain order. But others, a core group of about 3 guards, became increasingly sadistic. They invented humiliating punishments, forcing prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands, making them simulate sexual acts on each other, waking them every hour through the night, restricting food and water, using verbal abuse and psychological intimidation as tools of control. And here's the disturbing part. These weren't sociopaths. These were normal college kids who, 72 hours earlier, had no history of violence or cruelty. The roles had consumed them. They had become their uniforms. Zimbardo later identified 4 distinct phases in the breakdown of his prison experiment, and these phases are critical because they don't just describe what happened in 1971. They describe what happens every single time authority structures collapse or become abusive. Phase 1, role adoption. Participants accept their assigned roles and begin performing them, initially with uncertainty, but increasingly with confidence. This phase is characterized by testing boundaries. Guards test how much control they can exert. Prisoners test how much resistance they can offer. Social structures begin to solidify. This phase lasted roughly the first day. Phase 2, escalation and consolidation. The initial tests give way to established patterns. Guards who discovered that aggression worked become more aggressive. Prisoners who discovered that resistance led to punishment become more passive. The system begins to self-reinforce. Arbitrary rules replace rational order. Fear replaces cooperation. This phase ran from day 2 through day 4 and included the rebellion, the psychological breakdowns, and the growing brutality of the guards. Phase 3, normalization of abuse. By this point, extreme behavior has become routine. Guards no longer question whether it's appropriate to humiliate prisoners. Prisoners no longer question whether they deserve to be humiliated. The system has created its own reality. Outsiders who visit are shocked, but insiders see it as normal. Zimbardo himself, acting as superintendent, became so immersed that he stopped seeing the abuse. When prisoners' parents came to visit on day 4 and expressed concern, Zimbardo's response wasn't to shut down the study. It was to reassure them that everything was fine, that their sons were just playing roles. He had lost objectivity. He had become part of the system he was supposed to be observing. Phase 4, external intervention and collapse. The experiment didn't end because Zimbardo recognized the damage. It ended because someone from outside the system intervened. On day 5, Christina Masloch, a recently graduated psychologist and Zimbardo's girlfriend, visited the prison to conduct interviews. She watched the guards abuse the prisoners. She saw the degradation, the fear, the casual cruelty, and she was horrified. That night she confronted Zimbardo. She told him what he was doing was immoral, that he had lost his scientific objectivity, that he had become someone she didn't recognize. Zimbardo initially resisted. He defended the study, but her words broke through. The next morning, on day 6, Zimbardo gathered all the participants and said the words that ended the Stanford prison experiment. "The experiment is over. You are free to leave today." The prisoners, grown men who had voluntarily signed up for a study, cheered like hostages being released. Some cried. And the guards, several of them, looked genuinely disappointed that it was ending. Zimbardo spent the rest of his career analyzing what went wrong, and his conclusion was chilling. He wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man." Wait, that was Calhoun. Zimbardo wrote, "The line between good and evil is permeable, and almost anyone can be induced to cross it when pressured by situational forces." The Stanford prison experiment wasn't about bad people. It was about bad systems. It demonstrated that authority, when unchecked, when arbitrary, when embedded in structures that dehumanize, turns ordinary people into abusers and victims. Not because they want to, but because the roles demand it. Now you might be thinking, okay, disturbing experiment, but that was 50 years ago, in a basement, with college kids playing pretend. We have laws now, we have oversight, we have human rights protections. That can't happen in the real world. Except it does. It happens constantly. And in 2026, it's not happening in a basement, it's happening in institutions we depend on every single day. And if you know how to read the pattern, if you recognize the 4 phases, you can see exactly where we are right now. And it's not phase 1 anymore. In 1971, the collapse happened in 6 days in a Stanford basement. In 2026, the same pattern is unfolding at national scale. Only now the prison is every institution that's supposed to protect us. Governments, corporations, police, media, big tech. The Stanford prison experiment didn't just show that people can be cruel, it showed something more dangerous. When authority loses legitimacy and becomes pure costume and power, people stop obeying out of respect and start obeying out of fear or cynicism. And once that switch flips, both guards and prisoners eventually give up on the game. That is the beginning of authority collapse. In the experiment, the guards' authority didn't come from competence or moral standing or any history of leadership. It came from a cheap uniform, a wooden baton, and the approval of a distant figure called the superintendent. They didn't really know what was right. They only knew what they were allowed to do. That is the core of authority collapse. When those in charge no longer know why they rule, and those below no longer know why they obey, rules stop being moral anchors and become instruments of control. Prisoners stop believing they had rights. Guards stop believing they had limits. The result wasn't true order. It was a stable chaos where abuse became routine and submission became reflex. Look around in 2026. In many countries, trust in parliaments, presidents, Supreme Courts, police, media, and big companies is at historic lows. Police officers who feel hated by everyone. Teachers who are afraid of students and parents. Doctors attacked over bureaucratic decisions they don't control. Journalists seen as party operatives. Judges seen as factional warriors. And on the other side, citizens who look at any new rule, guideline, or mandate and quietly ask, is this actually for my safety or just for their control? When the honest answer in people's heads is increasingly, I don't know anymore, the experiment is no longer a metaphor. It's the operating system. Watch how Zimbardo's 4 phases reappear on a civilizational scale. Phase 1, role adoption. In the post-war and late 20th century, most people still believed in institutions. Police were protectors. Schools were ladders to a better life. Courts were impartial. The press was the watchdog. People accepted roles: citizen, public servant, professional, worker. The script wasn't perfect, but it was believable enough that most played along. Phase 2, escalation and consolidation. Over time, scandals piled up: corruption, unjust wars, financial crises, broken promises, double standards. Formal authority stayed in place, but it was increasingly used arbitrarily. Some elites discovered they could push the limits with almost no consequence. At the same time, many ordinary people discovered that resisting didn't change outcomes. Vote, protest, complain, nothing fundamental seemed to shift. The combination of abuse from above and powerlessness below solidified a system where people complied out of obligation, not conviction. Phase 3, normalization of abuse. This is where 2026 sits. Stories that would once have been unthinkable now flash by as 24-hour news items. Mass data leaks, algorithmic manipulation, multi-billion-dollar frauds, policies that openly favor the few at the expense of the many. Outsiders looking in are shocked. Insiders shrug. What would horrify a visitor has become just how things work. Like the guards who went home at night thinking their behavior was normal, executives and officials now press buttons that erase savings, kill careers, and reshape lives, and call it restructuring, content moderation, or compliance. Citizens, seeing this over and over, quietly adjust. Nothing will happen to them. Nothing will change. The experiment has become everyday life. Phase 4, intervention or collapse. In 1971, the experiment didn't end because the system reformed itself. It ended because an outsider, someone not trapped in the roles, walked in, saw the reality, and said, "This has to stop." In real societies, there are only two paths out of Phase 3. Either there is genuine external intervention, deep reforms, new social contracts, a reset of what counts as legitimate authority, or the system keeps rotting until nobody respects anything. Not laws, not courts, not media, not expertise. And when respect collapses completely, what comes next usually isn't freedom. It's a harsher form of power that promises to restore order by force. Here's the uncomfortable part. In the basement, the guards were not the system in some abstract sense. They were also its prisoners. Many finished the experiment ashamed, insisting, "That's not who I really am." In 2026, a huge layer of middle-level authority lives in that same dissonance. Managers enforcing policies they privately think are absurd. Police officers caught between orders, and conscience moderators applying rules that change weakly bureaucrats processing decisions they know are unjust but above their pay grade. They tell themselves, "It's my job. It's what the system requires." The line between doing your duty and enabling harm becomes so blurred that almost no one can see where it is anymore. On the other side, the public's response is less and less organized resistance and more quiet desertion. People stop voting because they're all the same. Stop reporting misconduct because nothing happens. Stop following news because it's all propaganda. This is the social version of what happened to the prisoners who began by shouting and ended by whispering. The cycle is always the same. Outrage, frustration, exhaustion, apathy. Authority collapses from the top down when it loses legitimacy, and from the bottom up when it loses recognition. That is the authority collapse. Not just when those in charge lose control, but when those below no longer grant them any moral right to lead. Between those two, a vacuum opens. In the next block, that vacuum becomes the main character because it's being filled by new micro-authorities, influencers, algorithms, ideological tribes, and parallel realities that answer to no one. And before we go there, if this is resonating with what you're seeing in your own country, subscribe and tell the comments what part of this theme hits you hardest. Your perspective is exactly the kind of outside voice the original experiment never had, and the kind societies in Phase 3 desperately need.